Okay, how's this? I'm not good with microphones. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? All right. A little closer. Beata says closer. Okay, well, welcome everybody. I am Sarah Van Exen. I'm GreenPAC's Executive Director. Thanks for joining us here tonight. If you don't know GreenPAC, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works across party lines to build environmental leadership in politics. Find me, I'd be happy to tell you a little more about our work. We're so glad to be hosting today's event today in partnership with TMU's The Dais and the Democratic Engagement Exchange. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we're gathered on today, land that I'm a settler and visitor on, and that is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. Today we're here to talk about climate change and elections. Climate change is our collective burden, and it's one that we cannot solve without prioritizing Indigenous knowledge, rights, sovereignty, relationships. Elections and the right to participate and vote in free democratic elections, that's our collective privilege. And so I invite all of us to think about our accountability to Indigenous people and the priority that reconciliation is being shown by the candidates to whom we choose to cast our votes when the next election rolls around. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to thank the sponsors who've made the event today possible. The Insurance Bureau of Canada, Power Corporation of Canada, the Cement Association of Canada, and our presenting sponsor, Bruce Power, for the great food and drinks and networking. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panel. I'll go in alphabetical order. Andrew Enns is the Executive Vice President of Leger's Central Canadian Operations. He has over 20 years experience in the Canadian market research industry and also has about a decade of experience working for the governments of Canada, Manitoba, and Ontario. Eric Grenier covers politics at the writ.ca, is the host of some great, or co-host of some great, host and co-host of some great podcasts, including The Writ and The Numbers. He's written and reported on elections, polls, and politics in major media sources for over 15 years. Chachi Curl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute and is frequently seen commenting on providing analysis and commenting on politics and polls to CBC, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Globe and Mail, you name it. Chachi, amongst many other things, was also a political reporter in her past career. And David Mackay is the National Observer's Deputy Managing Editor, a journalism teacher at Carleton, King's College, and here at TMU, and was formerly an award-winning investigative producer and reporter with the CBC. Before I turn it over to David, I just wanted to let you know that we will be taking audience questions. If you want to pose some to the panel, we'll have time for those at the end. There's a QR code and a Slido code there. Go into Slido, leave us your questions, and Raymond will pose some at the end. Thanks very much, and over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Okay. A lot of thumbs up. Okay, great. Well, this should be an illuminating conversation. I'm looking forward to this, and of course, we have been talking a lot about climate lately on the political level, and also because this is wildfire season, extreme weather. I think in the last couple of weeks, we've gone from extreme heat to near flooding to really wild fluctuations. So the weather, the extreme weather, it's something that we're all talking about, which is one of the reasons that we're here today. So let's get right to it. Chachi, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us a quick perspective on the relevance of climate change in the last few federal elections?
Sure. So this is very effectively loud. We often think about the evolution of issues, but when it comes to climate change as a voting issue, as a ballot issue, it's actually been more of a devolution. So what do I mean by that? The summer before the pandemic, summer of 2019, climate change was the #1 issue that Canadians were identifying as the most important to them, that they cared the most about in the country. at that time, heading into the 2019 election, the fact that you had leader Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives without a climate plan, basically putting them out of the running. That's despite the fact that the government and the Prime Minister of the day had gone through a series of scandals. They'd had black eyes over SNC-Lavalin, big problems around blackface. Didn't matter in a situation like that. A lack of a climate plan meant a lack of a path to victory. That was 2019. That was when 42% of Canadians said that this is the most important issue to me in the country today. Today, that number is 24%. It's still a top 5 issue, but it is not the ballot issue. And the number 1 issue is now housing affordability, cost of living, and that's not at 42%, that's close to 60, 66%. So you have both a change in terms of the number of Canadians identifying climate change as a top priority, but also the increase in the number of Canadians identifying a different issue, a secondary issue or a primary issue, if you will, as a top priority in much higher numbers. And that sadly, but realistically, is the story of where climate change ranks in that ladder of priorities in terms of what voters are thinking about. For a while it was the pandemic, it was access to health care, that continues to be there, but as long as you've got grocery bills as high as they are, as long as you've got housing costs as high as they are, climate change takes a back seat. And more crucially, the costs associated with climate change, or the costs perceived to be associated with climate change, become problematic in terms of what voters think. And so when we think about carbon pricing, for example, Canadians were told this is revenue neutral, this is net neutral to you, you're going to get money back. The problem is that the perception is that Canadians believe that they're paying out more than they're getting back, whether or not that's true. And 68% say that they don't believe that carbon pricing is actually effective when it comes to combating climate change, which is, I think, from a political perspective, almost terminal. Yay.
And
sorry.
do you want to pick up on that? What are you hearing? Are you hearing similar things?
Well, for sure. Sachi did a great job in terms of where the issue matrix is shifted, and that's huge because it's changed. It's taken climate change, even the carbon tax back in 2019. From it was an effective wedge issue for the Liberals, and they worked hard and they worked effectively to hold the Conservatives to a minority, or keep their minority situation. So now it's become it's a bell, it's a weight around the Liberal Party now, and it's going to be a problem for them in terms of that tax and in terms of the situation. And whether it will, it may shift, but we put out some numbers today on mortgage, and I know you guys have put numbers out on mortgages. That's the other shoe to drop in terms of the rising costs. That there are 35% of Canadians are renewing a mortgage in the next 18 months. Guaranteed, it's going to be worse for them when they renew. So that's not going to allow a lot of space in that sort of thinking at this stage of the, and the key thing is at Leisure we did a lot of work with an organization called Clean Prosperity, in looking at the climate change, the price on pollution aspect, and quite frankly we were working. I think they used some of that data to work on the Conservative Party to change that policy in 2021 for Aaron O'Toole. For a lot of those key voters in the GTA, the Lower Mainland, suburban household families that, they're most affected right now with cost of living, that's where this shift is probably really detrimental for the Liberal Party and opportunistic for the Conservative Party right now and those with those voters.
I have a quick follow-up, Andrew. So the inflation numbers are looking better. They're trending down. Food, housing, they're trending down. They're still high, but they're trending down. If they get low enough that the interest rates start to continue their downward trajectory. Does that change the conversation a bit in your mind?
We had our lowest inflation rate, I believe, last month since the big spike. And we coincidentally did a poll on grocery pricing and the boycott on Loblaws. And I think it was 62% of Canadians think grocery prices are still getting worse. So when you say inflation's going down, it's just the pace of them going up is slowing. But it's not like anything's getting cheaper. It's going to take time for households to just absorb the fact that this is a new reality. Wages for some will catch up, but it takes time. And I do think the other whammy of interest rates is going to hit, it's not everybody. Not everybody has a mortgage, but those that do, that's going to be a challenge to manage.
Eric, you are an aggregator, so you look at the work that these folks are doing, you put it through that smart brain of yours, and you look at the trends. What are we hearing? What are people saying about climate change as we've taken a look at this debate during a time when I would argue that the Liberals thought that we've done it. We've won at the Supreme Court. The population has spoken, and now it's risen as an issue again. So where do things stand from an aggregator's point of view?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is what Shachi was saying, and Andrew as well, is that these other issues take priority. And I think that's really what the challenge is, making climate change an election deciding issue. As in Shachi's polling, when you can choose several issues that are among the top 3 issues that you have, climate change will often score very highly because people do have a lot of concerns about the environment. They have concerns when they see wildfires. They have concerns that the planet is not heading in the right direction. But there was a poll that was done just by the Angus Reid Institute, I think it was late last year, and it had it very explicitly, if climate change policies will increase your cost of living, should you do things to reduce the cost of living? If it will decrease environmental progress, if you had to choose between, reduce my cost of living at the expense of climate action or fight against climate change at the expense of higher cost of living, it was something I think it was 56% who said, got to prioritize cost of living right now. 32% said they had to prioritize climate change. So in 2019, I think that climate change was a red line issue for a lot of voters. So when Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives came out with their climate plan, that was primarily just a glossy pamphlet rather than an actual plan. For a lot of voters, particularly in Quebec but in a lot of other places, that ruled them out as an option. I think now the number of Canadians who would choose climate change as a red line issue that says that they can't vote for the Conservatives is a lot lower than it was then, because those other cost of living, housing, has reduced the number of people who are ready to prioritize climate change over their own pocketbook.
Can I add a data point?
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. You want to jump in?
So just on that, the work that I was doing with Clean Prosperity, in February of 2020, we asked a question on whether or not you could, how could you support a party that did not have a serious climate change policy? And we had 61% said no, they couldn't. That was just before the pandemic, just after the 2019 election. I re-asked that a couple days ago just to see. And so that number's gone down to just over 40%. So that's the shift that you're sort of dealing with in terms of the inflation and how it's changed the attitudes.
And yeah, David, and to that point, it doesn't mean that people don't believe in climate change anymore or that there is a wholesale rejection of it being a real thing. There's still about 1 in 5 Canadians who are of the view that, yes, climate change is real, but it's natural caused, it's not human caused. But the vast majority in this country believe that it is real, it is human caused. They are seeing the evidence of it every winter, every spring, every summer. But again, it just goes down to what they feel like they can deal with. And the hopelessness factor is a really important factor to address as well. You've got, anywhere between 1 in 7, 1 in 10, so anywhere between 10 to 14% of Canadians who already now are at a place where they think it's too late. We can't do anything. So maybe that also speaks to the narrative and the storytelling that we're doing around climate change. If people don't feel like there's any point anymore, you start to lose the room. It's like, what's the point? Why am I bothering? It's why we see young people saying things like they don't want to have kids, they think it's already too late for the planet, et cetera, as opposed to, hey, we can actually, to use pandemic parlance, bend back the curve. And it may, I'm not a climate scientist, it may be objectively too late from that perspective, but there is nothing that demotivates people faster than you're screwed, there's no point.
Is there a breakdown in terms of region, age, when it comes to these kinds of attitudes, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely. Like certainly you see that places like British Columbia, Quebec in particular, far more supportive of climate change action, far more, I'd say, willing to have things like a carbon tax, even though it doesn't apply to Quebec. You do see that there's more support for that kind of government action in Quebec than you have in the rest of the country. And when it comes to the age groups, you do see younger people are much more concerned about the environment, much more supportive of environmental action than older people. But we've been talking a lot about the gains that the Conservatives have been able to make among younger voters who are very concerned about their chances to buy a house and have a life that's at least as good as their parents. There are going to be some of those voters who are concerned about the environment and housing affordability. But I think that when you're looking at the kind of Venn diagram of young voters, the ones that are supporting Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives and ones who really care about action on the environment, you're probably not seeing a huge amount of overlap between the two. So we do have the case that we have a lot of different, that people are not talking to the same groups of people. And I think that's really key here. Because when we're talking about the next election, Conservatives could win 45% of the vote. The other 55, or about 50%, voting for parties that will have a more robust climate change plan. But it's not just because of that those people will be voting for those other parties. So there are going to be some regional and age demographic differences, but whether it's going to be a decisive issue in the next campaign will depend on a lot of other factors.
So look into your crystal ball, the next federal election. Do you think that that will be the ballot box question, is climate change, carbon pricing, and everything that goes with it?
Yeah, maybe axe the tax. I think that'll probably be the thing we'll hear the most.
This won't be a climate change election. I mean, I think some parties may try, but it's going to be, that axe the tax, the affordability.
And just change.
Well, yeah, it's a referendum on the current prime minister. I think that's probably one of the bigger challenges, is that the poster boy for Canada's climate action is now like a dumpster fire. And that's not good. It's just unfortunate, and it's not, it's a whole host of reasons, but as he was the champion from 2015 on, he was the new hope. He was completely different from Harper, and he took the world by storm and introduced, a consumer carbon tax. But at this stage of the game, that's the problem now. It's him as your champion. It's very difficult to sort of rescue that, and I think it will be more of a referendum on the prime minister in a year from now.
Gotcha.
Agree with everything that Andrew says, but I think if we're able to look over the hill and then finally get past that, knowing that this is at this stage in June of 2024, looking at an election happening most likely in 2025, what we see today are pretty clear signs of a change election. But of course, a year is a lifetime in politics. That said, I do believe that we are past the point of, well, scrap everything, there's no longer going to be climate policy. If we can get past the rhetoric of it, the politics of it, and the polarization of it, which is being exploited incredibly in order to score political points, there is plenty of precedent of right-leaning governments in Western democracies around the world, including the one that's about to get kicked out in the UK, that went all in on green. Boris Johnson, for his many, many faults and foibles and tendency to throw parties in the middle of a pandemic, was all in on green power, was all in on nuclear, was all in on trying to make Britain a place where investment in green energy or less polluting energy was also going to be a competitive advantage economically. There is a blueprint for that. I think we need to talk about the fact that business and industry is already, it's frankly far ahead of where a lot of the political rhetoric is. You've got provinces that are already trying to figure it out. The problem for the Liberals and the problem for Justin Trudeau is they sunk so many eggs in the carbon pricing basket. They did not communicate about other ways to combat climate change. They did not talk about the role of industry. They did not talk about other things. They didn't talk about innovation or technology. It was all like, if you're against carbon pricing, you're against climate change. You are some sort of six-toed, mouth-breathing denialist. That is problematic from a messaging point of view because there are other tools in the toolbox. And you can argue the effectiveness of carbon pricing, and certainly there are those who would say it is profoundly effective, but there are other things that are effective that I think once we're done with the politics of it, I hope that we start to hear about. And I think any government in 2025 is going to have to go there just because we're going to be facing another very hot, very fiery summer.
Okay. So we're deep into the politics. Eric, this is your backyard. Are the politicians from the major parties giving voters enough information that they need in order to start thinking about who they're going to be voting for in terms of climate change? Or have we not got past the politics yet?
No, we haven't got past the politics, and we won't get past the politics until the campaign has gotten going, right?
Until the campaign's done.
You know, we do know what the Liberal plan is going to be, unless they change approach on the carbon tax, which seems like unlikely that they would do that. The New Democrats have been toying a little bit about whether they're going to go into a new direction. They're probably going to be watching what Wab Kinew is going to be doing in Manitoba. He is going to try to come forward with sort of a third way that could still apply within the federal framework for carbon action, climate change actions, so that they won't have the carbon tax applied to Manitoba anymore. And I would be surprised if Jagmeet Singh doesn't see that as a potential model to follow, because I think he probably looks at Wab Kinew as a successful New Democrat, and whatever a successful New Democrat's doing, Jagmeet Singh's going to want to do. But from Pierre Poilievre, we have not seen a lot of detail. We don't have a lot of detail from Pierre Poilievre on a lot of issues. Not unusual for an opposition politician to do that a year before an election. Sometimes they only come out with details when the platform is dropped several weeks into a campaign. We've heard him here talk a lot about trying to make it easier for business to invest in technology and innovation, that kind of thing, which is the kind of thing that is going to be appealing to a lot of voters because it means it doesn't cost them a dime. And we'll see if it actually will have any, well, it doesn't cost them, directly. Mm-hmm. But we haven't seen a lot from Pierre Poilievre, and I'm not sure that we're going to, because I think that he sees the same kind of data that we see all the time, knowing that this is not a huge issue for his voters, and that he can get away with having not much of a plan right now because people are going to be prioritizing these other issues and getting rid of the Liberal government.
Yeah. Well, and I would just say that the other, for sure, I would say the Poilievre folks are keeping an eye on is what's going to happen south of the border in November. I think what happens there and in terms of who's president, what that Congress looks like, has a bearing in terms of how Canada will, I think for him, that for Poilievre in terms of putting forward what sort of policies he puts forward for Canada, because it could be different. I mean, Trump is interesting in terms of his views on certain things, but he's much more sort of market focused, less ideological, and so I think that'll govern some things too in terms of how when and what you hear.
And maybe you're already doing this, but do you anticipate pollsters starting to sound people out about, well, what if Trump comes and he does this, that, and the other, then how does that affect how you may vote in Canada? Will you start to sort of start going down that road as pollsters, you think, or is it too
We've
soon?
seen some polls that ask Canadians, who do you trust more to handle Donald Trump? Generally, you have the same numbers that are favorable
Yeah.
to Pierre Poilievre than you do in other issues. So I think that whatever people see in Pierre Poilievre, they see him as able to handle Trump, to reduce the cost of living. It doesn't really matter that much, I don't think.
Yeah,
What about you mentioned, we haven't really talked a lot about the NDP, or the Greens for that matter. Eric, you talk about the fact that, even if the Conservatives are sitting at the high 40s right now, that means that about half of the people who would not vote for them if an election is being held tomorrow, and it's not, but if it was, then those are voters who feel passionately about the climate. What do they do? If they start to think, oh, geez, we could be headed for a Conservative majority, do their votes stay where they are, or do they jump, or do they just throw up their hands? Or are we paying enough attention to those votes and how they might rearrange themselves?
I see both Andrew and
Yeah, I see
Josh
shaking heads
their
here.
heads. So maybe
well,
they would like to-
I would just caution, if you think everybody who's not voting Conservative is passionate about the environment, that's not the case. So there's there's a lot of issues that, they're still voting Liberal, they're still voting NDP, and the environment's not part of that equation yet. So,
Nachi?
I mean, interestingly, again, going back to the polarization of politics and the polarization and politicization of every issue, a lot of people are not voting for Pierre Poilievre for reasons that have nothing to do with climate. Either they just can't stomach the guy, or they're worried about women's health, or they're worried about other aspects of the culture wars. That's a big, big driver, especially for young women, and especially for women. Actually, there's a huge gender gap, and you see, even though he's starting to close it, you see just how far Pierre Poilievre lags behind in terms of favorability among men, among women versus men.
Right.
So this idea that you might see an anybody but Poilievre kind of movement or a recoalescing of the center left over climate change, I would suggest at this stage is just not the case. There's a perfect, or a very imperfect, a scary storm happening. You've got a government that's been in power for the better part of a decade. By the time we finally get around to casting ballots, it will have been 10 years. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter who. There is a certain amount of cyclical cadence to regime change or government change in this country that says a decade and you're done. Mm-hmm. Might be a little bit less, might be a little bit more, but usually around that 10-year mark, doesn't matter, you're gonzo Alonzo. And so it is Justin Trudeau's time to maybe, and the Liberals' time more importantly, and the fact that Trudeau rebuilt the Liberal Party as a personality brand rather than a big tent party, right? When you rebuild an entire party's identity around yourself, and then you are dealing with some of the highest unfavorability or dissatisfaction numbers towards you personally as Prime Minister, it does not bode well for the future of your political party. So people are tired of Trudeau, which means they're tired of the Liberals, because there is no daylight between them, which means they are ready for change. And what Pierre Poilievre has managed to do that Andrew Scheer could not do, that Erin O'Toole could not do, is he's united his own caucus.
yeah.
He's also managed to deliver the messaging at a moment where Canadians, after a once-in-100-year situation around the pandemic, are ready to hear. They're very receptive to the messaging. If there is a movement to vote against Pierre Poilievre, it will have more to do with the scars of the convoy movement than it will have to do with climate change. On climate change, you actually see there is some amount of common ground across the political spectrum. Where the divisions occur, again, is around what to do about it, not it itself.
So people are ready for change, even though Eric just finished telling us that really Poilievre doesn't have to tell us what he's for, because why bother? So people are willing to change, but they don't know what they're getting. Does that make a whole lot of sense?
Generally, that's how it works. When a government is reached its
You guys have to decide.
yeah when a government reaches its best buy date, often as long as the change alternative is not terribly scary, then it's fine. At least it's not the party that's currently in power. So I think that the Liberals are hoping that the next election campaign can be a referendum on Poilievre. But if Justin Trudeau is still going to be there, it will inevitably be a referendum on Justin Trudeau. Just to go back to just quickly, the thing you said about voters moving around, we will get one little indication of how this thing could play out later on in the fall with the election in British Columbia. The New Democrats are the government there. The Conservatives they were previously a very fringe party, would get less than 2% of the vote, but right now that they gathered the center-right behind them, their leader was kicked out of the BC Liberals, in part because of his views on climate change and that it was
BC United.
BC United. They're now BC United, but was kicked out of
this week.
Of that party over his views on climate change because he questioned whether it was man-made or not. Will we see in that campaign that Green voters, because Greens still do pretty well in British Columbia, will they get behind the NDP to block what they will see as a very explicitly, climate change unfriendly party? So we'll get a clue of what's going to happen in October.
What about a little closer to home? There's a by-election here in St. Paul. Will we get, I know, by-elections, people, low voter turnout, it's not really a precursor of anything, but a lot of people are reading a lot into it. And I know you guys are. Does that play into this at all? Will it tell us anything? Change the conversation? What do you think?
Fact
Chachi?
that go ahead.
Oh, Chachi? I see you shaking your head vigorously.
I'm shaking my head in all sorts of directions. It means nothing, and yet we have to talk about it on
It'll
panels.
also mean everything.
Yes, it means nothing and it means everything. It's one of those it's more about the momentum and the emotional what parties and volunteers and fundraisers and strategists take from it emotionally more than it means anything in the grand scheme of the configuration of Parliament or any of the rest of it. If the Liberals can't win in what should be a stronghold for them, that's a problem. That's a pretty significant problem. It will put a lot of wind in the sails of the Conservatives if they're able to steal one. On the other hand, for all of the reasons you just pointed out, low voter turnout, it's June, people have other things on their minds. I imagine if the Maple Leafs were still in the playoffs.
Sachi, you got to give Eric does a whole podcast on this by-election. You got to give. There's more to it.
All right, Eric, I'm gonna defer to you because there's more to it.
Well, there's just one little thing to think about is that since Justin Trudeau became leader of the Liberal Party, and people might not realize it, the Liberals have never lost a seat in Toronto. They've won every single seat in Toronto for 3 elections in a row. If they would lose this one, does the Prime Minister stay on? And then that changes everything, right? If they end up winning, probably doesn't change all that much, and we'll delve into the numbers to try to read the tea leaves. But in reality, that is the biggest potential for it to matter and make a big difference in the next election.
But Eric, are you suggesting that the Prime Minister would go over a by-election result?
There's a lot of Liberals in that caucus that if they see that they don't win this seat, they're saying, I'm losing my seat too, and maybe this guy's going to take me down. So it could become a catalyst for something big.
Andrew, you wanted to weigh in?
No, I was just going to say that I think win or lose, loses is insane to think what maybe could happen there. But I do think that there'll be some, there's 76 other Liberals in Ontario that will look at that, extrapolate the results and the shift in vote, and start to ask some hard questions at the next cabinet, caucus retreats. And because, I don't know how much that changes, but a different leader at the helm of the Liberal Party does mix things up a bit. You get to put some dice back in for the Yahtzee game and get a few more rolls. So you never know what could come out of that. But yeah, it could be an interesting. And the BC, I think, Eric, you're right. That BC election will be interesting in the fall.
Andrew, I'm sure you're looking constantly, either on behalf of clients or publicly, at who might replace and to what extent that makes a difference. We've done names, we've run the usual names,
Yeah.
we've run the unusual names. And so far, what we're finding, and of course, that's why polling is a snapshot in time, and you constantly have to be snapping shots, but it makes absolutely no difference except for to a handful of soft liberal voters who are thinking about maybe going NDP, maybe staying home. So that's not enough to save the party. I know liberals have dreams of some liberals have dreams of a Mark Carney or a Christopher Freeland. Oh, if we just change the person at the top. But again, I go back to the indelibility of that brand. You don't spend 11, 12 years building a brand around one person and then show up and say, oh, we're a whole new party.
Flush it all away.
It's a whole new thing. It's like Lego. It's a new thing every day. No, you cannot deconstruct and reconstruct that quickly. And now we're just taking bets. And you're playing Yahtzee. And we're all having fun. But for that reason, I think that the prospect, even against a bruising by-election loss, which would be very embarrassing, I don't think even liberals themselves look around and say in a pre-election situation that they would somehow be better off dumping even an unpopular leader, because how much better could it get? We've seen what happened in Britain. He tried it like once and then twice and then
tried
three
one more
times
time, though.
and
Just
four
one more
times
time,
and then they
like
tried,
that.
yeah, just one more time. And just when that one more time was about to happen, the leader called an election, and now he's flying off a cliff, but they were headed in that direction anyway.
So we started the conversation taking a look at where things are at politically. And then we continue to talk about where things are at politically and what people think about climate change. And I do want to get to questions, but lest we give up our hands and say, well, what's the point? I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about opportunities. So is there any scenario that you folks can think of that can bump climate change higher up that list? Anything that could happen between now and, say, the next election?
Well, we have seen polling that suggests that when Canadians do see natural disasters, they do link it to climate change. When there was the wildfires last year, polling, I think was done by Abacus Data, showed that vast majority of Canadians agreed that this was a reflection or probably in some way caused by climate change. So these things do put it in people's mind. But it comes back to what we were talking about before. If there's a feeling that we're not going to be able to stop this, because even in the best case scenarios, it only gets no worse, right? It's not going to get much better. The best we can do is stop things getting worse. Then I think people's minds changed more to adaptation and things like that. We see that there's support for, Canadians have lots of support for those kinds of things, that we prepare for what climate change is going to do. So I think that is the kind of thing that can make it an important issue during an election campaign, but not so much in terms of what mechanisms we have in place to fight climate change, but just what the plan is about what we're going to do about the reality we're in.
Mm-hmm. Joshua?
I've been instructed not to leave us feeling sad, so I'm struggling around what to say. I mean, the thing is, I'm from the west coast of Canada. I live in British Columbia. Our next door neighbors are in Alberta. We've been dealing with summer after summer and season after season of relentless wildfires, relentless smoke, relentless destruction, relentless flooding. I found it somewhat interesting, that is a very neutral word, to see, top story on the National, front page, top line story on the Toronto Star Online, line story on the New York Times, because, oh, now we're getting smoke. Oh, I guess this is a thing now. Yeah, hi. Been living with it every year for many, many years. So quite beyond the fact that some of us have been living with this for quite a while. And so, no, we haven't necessarily seen that level of increased urgency or increased importance. It's also that in the moment, they do link it to climate change. They don't necessarily see it as something that, to Eric's point, they can do something about, or that it's going to be something that they want to vote along because of. I think we're not, and I said this a little bit earlier, the collective we are focusing too much on the politics and the personal leadership of it. We're not talking about the innovation. We're not talking about what students in creative destruction labs are doing. We're not talking enough about the policies of decarbonizing downtown cores and decarbonizing new construction and existing buildings. We're not talking about the requirements to take non-recyclables and single-use plastics out of supply chains, because that's not sexy. But if there is something that's going to mitigate and make it less worse, it's those types of things. We've seen from polling that when consumers are asked about, would you prefer products that kill the planet less? Yes, they do. But they don't feel like they have a choice around what their Amazon packaging comes in. I know that when I get something that's in plastic bubble tape, I'm sorry, planet, I'm sorry. When I get something that's cardboard, I feel a little bit better about it. And that's where consumers are at, and that's where citizens are at. So the whole yes-no binary around it, I'm good, you're bad, I don't know how constructive that is, and that's why I think we're not going to see progress until we start to, believe it or not, see this is politics, people, but until we start to depoliticize it.
Andrew?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, it is, you've talked a lot about the politics and everything around. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, in 2017, 18, it was a very, vocal debate on the carbon tax. 2019, it was a very effective political weapon used in that election campaign, and it's been politicized, and it's spread out to all of the things that Sachi's talked about, the innovation, the carbon cap. I mean, when you talk about that, you've got opponents saying you're just trying to distract from, the real issues, the real things at hand. The carbon tax is the most important thing that we've got to do. And you've got conservatives who are adamantly opposed. And so it's not a useful debate at all. And there's not a lot of progress on it. And to answer your question, David, there isn't going to be any issues that are going to elevate this at this particular, for this election. I really don't see it. Wildfires are going to happen. Floods are going to, it's supposed to be the worst hurricane season and for the eastern seaboard. People, in concern, worry about climate change and its impacts will go from low 60s to low 70s. But to the point made earlier, there's not a connection to action to that. That's a concern. That's a worry. But, to another point made, I'm doing what I can, and that's about all I can do, and we'll carry on. And I'm more worried about protecting my life and property. Lots of adaptation work going on in British Columbia and things like that. Until there's going to be this election, and then I think we need to, things will happen with the carbon tax. Some people will be upset, but there needs to be a focus on what else can we do? And, we've got a sponsor here who's talking of, nuclear power. Lots of governments would like to talk about nuclear power, but when they do, they get a lot of grief. Like there's a lot of hostility from groups out there when it comes to nuclear power. And, that could be another big part of the conversation. I mean, there's northern communities in Canada that have no choice but to burn really heavy diesel fuel to power everything where they are. Nuclear could work, but it has to become more acceptable, and so there could be more rational debate, but I think we're going to have a bit of a cathartic moment on where we're currently at.
One more question before we throw things to the audience. Are we asking the right question? And I ask this because the PBO has been raked over the coals in some quarters for saying, yes, carbon pricing could cost us more down the road, but some detractors say, well, you didn't really compare that with the cost of doing nothing, right? So if we do nothing, then what? So I'm wondering, are we asking people the right question when it comes to carbon pricing, climate change, which we agree is a problem? Are we asking the right questions?
I think right now the debate is, as Andrew says, has just become so polarized around the carbon tax. Conservatives at one point supported a carbon pricing scheme, right? It's become such a polarizing issue that in a way it almost has to die so that we can start talking about something else. And I think that's what goes to what Andrew was talking about. The carbon pricing plan might be the best one in place. Lots of studies have shown that it is more effective than other kinds of regulatory efforts and this kind of thing. But it's just become so politically toxic that if we can get past it, then we might be able to talk about something else. Because right now, the only thing that's being talked about, not the only, but largely the only thing being talked about from the Liberals is carbon tax is the way, and if you don't, as Justin Trudeau said, Pierre Poilievre wants to see the world burn because he's against the carbon tax. And Pierre Poilievre is just saying that the only thing that matters is that the carbon tax is costing people too much and it's ineffective, so we're just going to get rid of it. Afterwards, what are we going to talk about? I think that's where the question might become a bit more about what do we do.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, like there are lots of folks in this country that think taxing me for one thing and then sending it all back to me 4 times a year, that just sounds stupid.
People
there's just a lot of people go, this doesn't make any sense. Like if you're going to tax me, keep it and do something with it.
And there are some provinces where we don't even get it back. So again,
Well,
the consumer aspect of it, to your point, is this supposed to be about behavior change when the options available to me around changing my behavior are still limited? In an era where EVs, access to EVs from a cost perspective, access to charging stations in all but a handful of super urban centers, when there still is a lack of faith that, if something goes on with your EV in November, driving down the 401 in minus 12 degrees, like people worry about that and they want to feel safe and they want to feel secure. And this, you can't, these are not little narco running cigarette boats between Cuba and Florida that go really fast and can turn on a dime. We're talking about 70 years of vehicular consumer behavior and mindsets. We're not going to EV our way out of this. We're not going to battery our way out of this. We're not going to carbon price our way out of this. It's actually got to be a number of different things. And you can make the argument that we're running out of time, and that's fine, but it doesn't fix the resistance or the hesitation.
But who's ever prime minister's got about 25 billion reasons to try to make EV vehicles work in this country now, in this province. I mean, there's a lot of federal and provincial money tied up in EV manufacturing, EV batteries, which, again, you may be afraid of a Poilievre prime minister, but it's in his best interest to make those vehicles, make those plants productive, make them profitable, so taxpayers get some of that money back. And I think that's what you'll see. It'll just maybe more of a market-driven, approach as opposed to maybe a hard regulatory. But like the industry, as such you said earlier, industry's getting there. Like there's lots of stuff going on, and I think that's when you talk about a hopelessness and sort of amongst a lot of the population that it just never seems to be enough. We're not doing it at the right time, or not soon enough, or not enough. It'd be good to do a bit more of we are making progress. Like some of this is good progress. This is going to have an impact. Because, for some reason, we put a lot of money in those plants. It's going to work.
I can't help but laugh because in some ways, we've now managed to reduce this right back to the right-left binary. More government intervention and regulation and bigger government versus smaller government and market-based decisions. Whatever you agree or disagree, we have seen governments, come and go and change and not change. They're going to bring their lens and their view to these things. We did big government, more regulation for 10 years. That appears to be sunsetting. We'll see what the next sunrise brings.
In short, we're still trying to figure stuff out, right?
Yeah.
We've got, where are my bosses? We've got 10 minutes for questions. We're right on time.
Hello. These are some questions that were submitted through the Slido. So if you would like to submit your question, you can still submit your question, and I'll be looking at the Slido to ask some questions to our lovely panelists. So our first question is, how might the election address young people who feel hopeless and believe it is too late to prevent catastrophic climate change?
Oof. That's a good one.
Delicately, probably. Yeah, that I think is a real challenge because if you're a young voter who feels kind of that there isn't much of a future on this, I'm not sure what governments can tell you that is going to fix it in any time soon. Because as I said, if we stopped putting out greenhouse gas emissions today, the Earth is still going to be warmer than it was before, right? So I think that's why you see for a lot of the younger voters are being appealed to by Pierre Poilievre largely around cost of living issues, because that has been, I think, what is a major concern for a lot of young voters. But I don't really have an answer for that because I'm not sure if there is actually a good one.
I mean, it's a difficult question for sure. I think that, finding, instead of pressing candidates on, a hard line, like, are you here? If you're not here, then you're against what I believe in. Look for some opportunities, like find ways. I mean, electric vehicles is an example. I mean, it's not just a solution to potentially reducing carbon emissions in our economy, but it's job creation, it's technological advancement. So, look for some of those opportunities, and maybe find some hope there. But it's a tough question.
So the next question is, what kind of green or sustainable policies still poll well when people are focused on their pocketbook issues?
Sachi? Why don't you take that one?
I'm trying to think. At the risk of sounding repetitive, and we can accuse consumers or voters of wanting to basically take the solution off their plate or out of their wallets. But where people are prepared to lean in is around policies, smaller regulations, innovation incentives to take the bad stuff out of their houses, out of their refrigerators, out of their shopping bags, out of their packaging. That's a very small aspect of it, because at the same time, they're all buying things online madly, and those trucks are driving. But that said, even there, regulations, again, going back to big business and industry, it really comes down to the extent to which people feel like, well, what is the biggest source or the biggest driver of emissions? And while we've seen through years of polling that Canadians feel like they can personally make a change, that they have a responsibility personally at the household level, at the personal level, to make a change, they're also under no illusion that they're not the factory emitting the bulk of the emissions. So things that either incent or regulate big business to adapt and change and look at new ways, which again, we see industry is doing it. They may not be doing it fast enough. They may not be doing it as enough to people's satisfaction. But the fact is that media reportage, politicians, the public narrative is not spending enough time talking about that aspect of things. And again, when you take it right down to that consumer level, yes, you can recycle the hell out of everything. You can spend your whole day or your whole Saturday morning, as I do, doing all of your bins and separating your organics from this, from that, taking things to the depot. That's great, and I do it. But ultimately, that's not enough. And where we need to, and I think where voters agree, is around wanting to, number one, see more change at the industry and the industrial level, but also hear more about progress at the industry and industrial level.
And I would say that that's on us in the media. I think we've got to be telling more of those stories. I think businesses have to become a bigger part of the conversation. Thus far, they've been reluctant to do that. They have allowed lobbyists and spokespeople to do it. They've got to be telling their own stories. So if there's anyone here from business listening, you might want to jump into the conversation for sure. Yeah. Next question.
Sure. The next question is kind of related to this one. It is on how can politicians convey to voters that affordability and housing concerns are tied with climate change, and what's really the key message that needs to be delivered?
That's what's really actually interesting, because part of the reasons a lot of things are more expensive is because of climate change, that it's made it harder to produce food, it's made it harder to have supply lines that are consistent and you can rely on. But making that connection is extremely important, because I think that is the way to get people to think of climate change as a pocketbook issue. But it is still a very, it's an abstract concept, right? Because it's not directly related to what you're spending on a given day. You know, if your insurance premiums are higher, you're not thinking about it's because of the fact that flooding is more common and fires or wildfires are more common. But tying those two things together, I think, is probably one of the key aspects to it. So then when you do have, just to bring it back to the carbon tax, that kind of policy, which adds a cost, people have a hard time trying to understand how the cost is actually going to save them money in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Jackie?
I think ditto what Eric said.
Okay. Andrew?
You know, I would just say that, you know, I agree with what Eric said. I also think that's an opportunity for business to get in the grill of government. You know, particularly if there's a government of a different persuasion in Ottawa after October next year, where like the economic arguments for, you know, doing things with respect to climate change, whether it's ensuring supply lines are open. I mean, the flooding that was in your province a couple years ago wiped out railways, major highways. I mean, that cost billions and shook the entire country. So those are the kind of arguments that will get finance ministers and prime ministers paying attention to the fact that there needs, like, we can't just close our eyes to this. There has to be some stuff that we have to be doing stuff. And if the public, and I agree with Eric, I mean, it's a tenuous connection now, but if it becomes clearer and becomes stronger, then again, the government could be on the hot seat for needing to do more and having a more deliberate plan in that area.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, and I think everyone is thinking about this and has this on their mind. What are your predictions for 2025? And how might, there's a bunch of them, but how might a minority government affect climate politics? And the last sort of question that's in this sort of field is there even a possibility of turning the polls around for the incumbent government?
That's been answered.
Anything's theoretically possible, but a 20-point lead is pretty hard to overcome. But, you know, we are talking as if we're assuming that Pierre Poilievre will become a majority prime minister next year. I'd say the odds, based on all the fundamentals, the polling, suggest that he's very likely to win the next election. But we can't rule out the fact that it could be a minority government, in which case it will require negotiations between parties, and that's when there could be some more interesting movement perhaps on some of these issues, on climate change being one of them, because one of the things that would keep the government in power, you have three parties, the Bloc Québécois, the Liberals, the NDP, they all care about this issue. It could become interesting if that is a minority government, which is completely a possibility. The polls don't have to move. The polls have to move almost an unreasonable amount for the Liberals to get reelected, but they don't have to move that much for it to be a minority government.
Jackie?
Well, stranger things have happened, and I often say the same thing, is you've got to leave, you know, about 15, 10, 15, 20% at the highest level, like wiggle room just for a Poilievre implosion. I don't foresee it, but stranger things have happened in politics. I think the thing that we're not actually talking about is a snap election in Ontario and what the impacts would be around that, what that means in terms of all of the things that Andrew's just talked about around EV policy, around other policies. You know, you've got a premier who's running around trying to free your beer right now, and he's doing it for a reason.
Yep.
Paper bags.
Andrew? You get last word.
Well, look, I kind of with my two colleagues. First of all, in the polling business, we don't like any certainty in elections. We want to keep everything up in the air, so we do lots of work in terms of trying to figure out what's going to happen. But I would say that it would be, there'd be some significant, have to be some significant change in terms of the trajectory. The minority situation, yep, interesting. I think, you know, whether either the main opposition parties would be looking to go right back to the polls on, say, you know, whether or not they agree to axe the tax is probably doubtful, because they'll both be looking for probably new leaders at the time. So, yeah, I think it's probably a poly of government, and I think that, you know, some will think it's doom and gloom, but I think there's opportunity with any newly elected government, particularly with a government that's going to win, that will likely win seats in a lot of areas where it hasn't won seats for a very long time, and will be very interested in trying to hold on to those seats, and will understand that they need to work hard at that from the get-go, and I think there's always opportunity with that.
Okay, so back to me. To wrap us up, I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in and for coming out today. A lot of this, if you're concerned about climate change, is pretty sobering, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us who are climate concerned to think not just about the polling, but also about what we know about democracy right now, which is also a bit of a downer. Chashi was at the Democratic Engagement Exchange Canadian Vote Summit last week, and what we heard there is that democracy is also going through a bit of a rough period right now. Trust in politicians is down, trust in institutions is down, but if you're climate concerned, it's important to know that who people trust right now, it's our friends and our family. And there are deep interconnections between all the things people are concerned about and climate change. Climate change is making all those concerns worse. We heard that tonight, but people aren't going to get that message right now necessarily from our political leaders. They'll get it through conversations with friends and family. There are great organizations out there like Reclimate and Neighbours United and Talk Climate to Me that are doing a bang-up job helping Canadians who care about this stuff learn how to have those conversations in ways that is depolarizing, that builds bridges, even though you may have different value systems and different perspectives on carbon pricing. And I wanted to encourage all of us to think about those things. It may not change the polls enormously, but it's pretty relevant that we all, if we care, are talking about it. I'd like to thank our sponsors for helping us to host this event tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out, and I'd also really like to thank David and all of our panelists for the interesting conversation. And I'm just going to wrap up by saying we've got another QR code up here for survey feedback. We'd be happy to know what you thought about this event and what else you'd like to hear about from us in the future. At the beginning of the night, we learned that certain things are not good to do on spring evenings in June. So I just want to really thank you for giving up your Tuesday night in June, spring evening. Not that warm, but please get out there and enjoy the night.